My name is Captain Fiona Bond, 31 years old, and I was taught that silence is a form of discipline. But today, in the stifling lawyer's office in La Jolla, my silence was a shield. My brother Sebastian took a sip of his scotch and smirked. Dad left the entire company and the house to me. For our little sister, he glanced at my uniform with disgust. She gets to keep the antique gun collection, a cute hobby for a girl who likes to play with toy soldiers. The family erupted in laughter, a sharp metallic sound like daggers clinking together, and I could feel my ribs tighten. My Aunt Patricia added, "At least Sebastian knows how to make real money, not just collect a government paycheck to run around in the desert." I clenched my fists under the table, my nails digging into my palms. They had no idea that my game of toy soldiers had taught me the single most important thing. You always secure your intelligence before you enter the battle. And this battle I had already won 5 years ago. Before I tell you my story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe if you've ever had your career and your sacrifices belittled by the very people who should have been your biggest supporters. This story is for all of us. The air in Mr. Harrison's office was heavy, thick with the scent of old paper, expensive leather, and a suffocating sense of entitlement that didn't come from me. Outside the grand floor-to-ceiling window, pristine white yachts bobbed gently in the La Jolla Cove, their sails neatly furled. It was a world of effortless wealth, a world I had been born into but never truly belonged to. Inside, every pair of eyes in my family was fixed on my brother, Sebastian, as he held court. He was in the middle of a self-congratulatory monologue about his grand vision for Aegis Dynamics, pacing in front of the mahogany desk in his tailored Italian suit. He threw around corporate buzzwords like synergy and disruptive thinking with the confidence of a man who had just read them in the latest issue of Forbes on his private flight here. I let my gaze fall to my own feet, planted firmly on the floor. My combat boots, the same ones that had carried me across the unforgiving terrain of Afghanistan, looked out of place against the deep crimson and blue of the Persian rug. They were scuffed, worn, and coated in a fine layer of dust that felt more honest than anything else in the room. My stepmother, Cynthia, a woman whose entire existence revolved around maintaining a flawless exterior, noticed them immediately. She leaned toward me, her voice a perfectly manicured whisper. With a faint, polite smile, she discreetly slid a linen cocktail napkin across the polished wood of the table. "Fiona, darling," she murmured, her eyes flicking down to my feet. "Could you perhaps wipe some of that dust off your boots? It doesn't quite go with the decor." It wasn't a request. It was a reminder, a quiet surgical strike to inform me that my world, my service, my reality, was an unsightly mess that needed to be cleaned up before it could be allowed in their presence. I was an inconvenience, a smudge on their perfect picture. Sebastian continued his performance, pointing a perfectly buffed finger at a complex-looking chart I knew for a fact his assistant had created last night. "As you can see," he said, addressing Mr. Harrison but playing to the rest of the room, "our growth projections are astronomical once I trim the fat, cut away some of the unnecessary legacy branches." As he said the word legacy, his eyes darted to me for a fraction of a second. It was his code word, the dismissive term he used for the small, passion-driven projects my father had insisted on maintaining, programs that helped veteran-owned startups secure their first contracts. To our father, a retired Army colonel, it was a matter of honor. To Sebastian, it was a line item on an expense report. "The company needs a real leader," he went on, puffing out his chest. "Someone who understands Wall Street, not just a bunch of military bases." He said it with such casual arrogance, completely oblivious to the fact that I was silently calculating in my head how the single largest contract Aegis had secured last year, the one that had kept the company profitable, was a direct result of connections I had personally cultivated at the Pentagon. I had done it quietly, without fanfare, because that's what we do. The mission comes first. My Aunt Patricia, a woman whose primary occupation was managing her inheritance from her first 2 husbands, nodded with sage-like approval. "Sebastian is right, of course," she chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension. "Thomas was always a bit soft on those soldier types." She looked at me, a patronizing smile playing on her lips. A CEO has to be tough, Fiona. He has to put profits above sentiment. You understand that, don't you? You're used to following orders. The venom in her words was more potent than Sebastian's blatant narcissism. She wasn't just dismissing me, she was twisting the very principles of order, discipline, and respect that formed the bedrock of my world and turning them into a mark of subservience. I simply looked at her, my face a mask of neutrality. In the military, we're taught not to waste ammunition on targets of no strategic value. Arguing with people who fundamentally misunderstand the battlefield is pointless. Right then, they were all targets not worth a bullet. I remembered one of the first rules of intelligence gathering: observe, assess, and act only when you have the advantage. My advantage was coming. They just didn't know it yet. Sebastian concluded his grand presentation by raising his glass of Macallan 18. To the future of Aegis, he declared, his voice booming with unearned triumph. My stepmother, my aunt, my cousins. They all raised their glasses in a toast, a silent chorus of agreement. They were celebrating a victory that didn't exist. And in that moment of suffocating smugness, a small, quiet sound cut through the air. Mr. Harrison, who had been sitting behind his desk like a statue, observing everything with the patient eyes of a man who had seen it all, cleared his throat. It wasn't a loud noise, but in the charged silence that followed their toast, it sounded like a gunshot. He didn't look at Sebastian. His gaze shifted, just for a second, and landed directly on me. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a shared understanding, perhaps a signal. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached out and slid Sebastian's glossy presentation to the far side of his desk, a gesture of quiet dismissal. He then reached down, out of sight, and when his hand reappeared, it was holding a different folder. It was a simple binder, but its color spoke volumes. It was bound in a deep, olive-drab leather, the exact shade of an army dress uniform. The cheerful atmosphere in the room evaporated instantly. The air grew cold. Sebastian's confident smile froze on his face, cracking like cheap veneer. He stared at the folder as if it were a live grenade. The war for my father's legacy had been a quiet, cold one for years. But now, the first shot was about to be fired. My battle was about to begin. That olive-drab binder on Mr. Harrison's desk wasn't just a file. It was a ghost from my past, a symbol of a promise I'd made to myself long ago. As Sebastian stared at it, his arrogance finally cracking, my mind wasn't entirely in that stifling room in La Jolla. It was 13 years earlier, standing under the oppressive heat of a New York summer, the humidity so thick it felt like you could grab a handful of it. I remember reception day at West Point with perfect clarity. While other families were clinging to their sons and daughters, tears streaming down their faces as they offered words of love and encouragement, my own family stood apart. My stepmother, Cynthia, fanned her face with a program, complaining that the moisture in the air was going to ruin her blowout. My father, the decorated colonel, stood ramrod straight, his eyes scanning the historic grounds not with pride, but with a kind of grim duty. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm, but without warmth. "Don't embarrass the family, Fiona," was all he said. It wasn't advice. It was a command, an insinuation that my chosen path was already a potential source of shame. Just then, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his entire demeanor changed. The stern mask dissolved into a broad, genuine smile. "Sebastian!" he boomed into the phone. "How's the Mediterranean?" My brother was calling from a yacht somewhere off the coast of Greece, crowing about having just met the daughter of a shipping tycoon. My father was instantly engaged, laughing, talking animatedly about the importance of making the right connections. He turned his back to me, already absorbed in Sebastian's world of glittering privilege. I was left alone in front of the imposing stone archway, watching the other cadets say their tearful goodbyes. In that moment, I understood. My journey wasn't a source of pride for them. It was an inconvenient detour from the main event, Sebastian's glorious ascent. The first 6 weeks at West Point are officially called Cadet Basic Training. Unofficially, everyone calls it Beast Barracks, and it is designed to be a special kind of hell. It's meant to break you down and build you back up as a soldier. We were pushed past every conceivable limit. I low-crawled through mud so thick it felt like quicksand, my muscles screaming in protest. I marched for miles under the relentless rain of a summer storm, my pack digging into my raw shoulders. I learned to field strip and reassemble my M4 rifle in pitch darkness until my fingers were numb and my mind was a fog of exhaustion. Every night, I'd collapse onto my rock-hard cot, every inch of my body aching. Sleep was a luxury. In those brief, quiet moments before exhaustion claimed me, I would think of Sebastian. During the rare, short phone calls I was allowed, he'd tell me about his summer. He was taking a wine-tasting course in Napa Valley, a necessary business skill, he'd called it, paid for, of course, by our father. He'd laughed over the phone, his voice clear and untroubled. While you're playing war games in the mud, Fiona, I'm learning about things with real value. That contrast, the sheer, glaring injustice of it, should have broken me. Instead, it did the opposite. It forged my will into something harder than I ever imagined possible. It became my fuel. 4 years later, I stood on the parade ground at graduation, one of only a handful of women in my class to make it through. My uniform was immaculate, my posture perfect, the culmination of thousands of hours of discipline and sacrifice. My family was there, somewhere in the vast sea of faces. They looked bored, lost. They sat far back, complaining about the length of the ceremony and taking selfies to post on Instagram. When the time came for the pinning ceremony, a sacred tradition where a family member pins the new rank onto the graduate's shoulders, my father walked onto the field. His steps were mechanical. He took the 2 gold bars of a second lieutenant from the velvet box and pinned them onto my shoulders with a clinical precision. There was no hug, no, "I'm proud of you, son," or daughter. There were no tears in his eyes, just a quiet, perfunctory, "Good luck out there." And then his phone buzzed again. He stepped back, his duty done, and immediately answered. "Sebastian? What's wrong?" I heard him say, his voice filled with a sudden, urgent concern that had been absent just moments before. My brother, it turned out, was having a crisis in Las Vegas. He had misplaced his new Rolex at a nightclub. In that moment, the proudest day of my life became the loneliest. I stood there, a newly commissioned officer in the United States Army, feeling completely and utterly invisible. That night, while my classmates celebrated with their cheering families, I walked alone across the plain to Thayer Monument. It's a tall granite sentinel overlooking the Hudson River, its base inscribed with the names of West Point graduates who had died in service to the country. I ran my fingers over the cold, etched letters, each name a story of sacrifice, of a life given for something larger than themselves. And there, in the quiet company of heroes, I made a silent vow. I would never again seek their approval. I would never again hunger for a validation they were incapable of giving. Respect, I realized, wasn't something you could beg for. It had to be earned, commanded. I would serve my country with honor. I would become the best damned officer I could possibly be. And one day, not with words, but with my actions, with my very existence, I would show them what they had so carelessly dismissed. I would become my own fortress. That vow became the foundation upon which I built my life. Inside one of the computer labs at the academy, there was a quote from Navy Admiral Grace Hopper etched on a plaque. "It's easier to ask forgiveness than it is to get permission." It had always stuck with me, a quiet endorsement of bold, decisive action. Now, back in this suffocating room, watching the color drain from Sebastian's face, I felt the steel of that old vow solidify in my spine. The time for silent service was over. It was time to execute the final part of my promise. The vow I made at West Point wasn't some dramatic, youthful declaration. It was a quiet realignment of my internal compass. It set my course. For the next decade, while my family continued their lives in the sun-drenched comfort of Southern California, my world was defined by very different landscapes. I remember the long nights at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. The air there is thin and cold, and it always carries the metallic taste of dust. There was a constant low roar from the transport planes that never seemed to cease, a sound that became the soundtrack to my life. My office was a cramped shipping container, retrofitted with servers, monitors, and maps. The only decoration was a dog-eared copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, a gift from my father before my first deployment. I'd often read one particular line: "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." My family's indifference, Sebastian's condescension, they were my impediments. They became my way. My mission was intelligence analysis. I sifted through mountains of data, drone surveillance, signal intercepts, informant reports, piecing together puzzles to predict enemy movements and protect American lives. My world was one of 18-hour days fueled by black coffee and MREs, meals ready to eat. Sleep was a commodity, not a guarantee. One Christmas, a care package arrived from my family. For a brief moment, a foolish flicker of hope ignited in my chest. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd sent something personal. Something that said, "We're thinking of you." I tore it open. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a high-end Chanel cosmetics set: lipstick, blush, eyeshadow. Tucked inside was a card from my stepmother, written in her perfect flowing script: "Hoping you soon find a nice man and settle down." I just stared at it. Then, a dry, bitter laugh escaped my lips. It was so absurd it was almost funny. They were picturing me at galas in San Diego, while I was sitting in a metal box half a world away, trying to figure out if the intel on a new IED threat was credible enough to reroute a convoy and keep a dozen soldiers from being blown to pieces. They didn't just not understand my life, they had replaced it with a fictional version that was more comfortable for them. In the midst of reports on ambushes and bomb threats, I'd occasionally get an email from Sebastian. His messages felt like transmissions from another planet. He'd boast about closing a deal to supply office stationery to a local law firm. He'd attach photos of himself at a charity golf tournament, posing with some minor celebrity. He always signed off with the same patronizing line: "You handle your thing, Fiona. I'll handle building the empire." He had no idea. He didn't know that during one of those sleepless nights in Bagram, fueled by stale coffee, I had used my knowledge of emerging satellite communication technologies to help my father's team draft a proposal for a new secure comms system. My on-the-ground understanding of the military's actual needs gave Aegis an edge its competitors, staffed by civilians, simply didn't have. We won that contract, the biggest in the company's history at the time. I did it silently, from the shadows, because it was the right thing to do for the company my father built. I never asked for credit. It was simply part of the mission. The real turning point came 5 years ago. That's the date that mattered. I was stationed in Germany, working a joint operations desk job. My phone rang late one night. It was my father, and his voice was strained with a fatigue that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Sebastian has almost ruined everything," he said, the words heavy with defeat. My brother, in a fit of supreme arrogance and incompetence, had submitted a major proposal to the Pentagon. He'd gotten the technical specifications wrong, the cost analysis was wildly unrealistic, and he had promised a delivery schedule that was pure fantasy. Aegis wasn't just facing rejection, the company was on the verge of being blacklisted for submitting a fraudulent bid. My father sounded helpless. "I'm getting too old for this, Fiona," he admitted, and it was the first time I'd ever heard him sound truly broken. That night, and for many nights after, I didn't sleep. While Sebastian was on a soul-searching yoga retreat in Bali, I saw the pictures on his Instagram. I was at my desk in a Ramstein barracks, thousands of miles away. I made calls to my contacts. I pulled up satellite imagery, cross-referenced supply chain data, and spent hours on secure video calls with Aegis engineers, walking them through the military's actual requirements. I rewrote the entire technical section of the proposal, recalibrating the costs, and laying out a logistics plan that was aggressive but achievable. I was fighting for my father's company, for his legacy, from halfway around the world, cleaning up a mess I didn't create. A week later, after the revised proposal was accepted, my father called me again. The weariness in his voice was gone. In its place was a cold, hard clarity, the voice of the colonel I remembered from my childhood. It was the voice of a man who had made a command decision. "Fiona," he said, and there was no preamble. "This company, this legacy? It needs a commander, not a princeling. It needs someone who understands the mission, not just the profit margin. He paused, and I could hear him take a deep breath. I know what I have to do now. At the time, I didn't fully grasp the weight of his words. I thought he was just venting, speaking out of frustration. But now, sitting here in this office, my eyes fixed on the olive drab binder Mr. Harrison held in his hands, it all clicked into place. My father, a lifelong strategist, hadn't just been venting his anger. He had been drafting his final battle plan. My father's final battle plan began not with a bang, but with an email. A few weeks after that fateful phone call from Germany, while I was preparing for a new deployment, a message from Mr. Harrison landed in my inbox. It wasn't about Aegis, or trusts, or legal matters. It was an invitation. My wife Martha makes the best roast chicken in San Diego, he wrote. We'd be honored if you'd join us for dinner on Friday. I hesitated. I wasn't used to social invitations that weren't steeped in obligation or corporate networking. My family dinners were performances. This felt different. Something in the simple sincerity of his words made me accept. That Friday evening, I found myself driving to their home in Point Loma. A cozy, unassuming house with a porch swing and a garden full of blooming bougainvillea. When I stepped inside, the contrast with my family's world was immediate and overwhelming. There were no Persian rugs or crystal glasses. Instead, the air was filled with the rich, savory aroma of roasting chicken and rosemary, the sound of easy laughter from the kitchen, and the happy thumping of a tail against the hardwood floor. An old, gray-muzzled golden retriever named Gunner trotted over to greet me as if I were a long-lost friend. Martha Harrison greeted me with a warm hug that felt completely natural, as if she'd known me for years. She was a retired Army nurse, and you could see a quiet strength and a deep well of empathy in her eyes. Over dinner, she didn't ask me a single question about combat or loss or any of the things people usually ask soldiers with a morbid curiosity. Instead, she asked about the soldiers under my command, what their names were, where they were from. She asked me what food I missed the most when I was deployed. A question so simple and so profoundly human, it almost made my throat close up. As we sat around their dinner table, passing bowls of mashed potatoes and green beans, I reached for the salt. For a moment, the sleeve of my sweater slid back, revealing the back of my hand. Martha's eyes briefly fell upon the small silvery scars there, a faint, starburst pattern left over from an IED blast years ago. I saw a flicker of recognition, of shared understanding in her gaze, but she didn't ask. She didn't say a word. A moment later, she simply reached across the table and gently placed her warm hand over mine for just a second. There was no pity in her touch, only a silent, profound empathy. It was a wordless acknowledgement of a reality I always kept hidden. For the first time in a very, very long time, I felt seen. Not as a soldier, not as the rebellious daughter, but just as a person. After dinner, Mr. Harrison, he insisted I call him Tom, and I sat on the back porch overlooking the harbor, the lights of the city twinkling across the water. We didn't talk about my father's plan or the future of Aegis. Instead, he told me stories about his time as a young lieutenant in Vietnam, about the brotherhood and the loss. He listened, truly listened, as I talked about West Point, about the challenges of being a female officer in a world built by men. Thomas was incredibly proud of you, Fiona, he said quietly, his voice gentle. He never knew how to show it. The man was trapped between two worlds, the one he came from and the one he wanted for his son. It wasn't an excuse for my father's failings, but it was an explanation, a piece of truth that eased a knot in my chest I didn't even know was there. Driving back to my small apartment that night, I had to pull over. The tears came not from a place of sadness, but from an overwhelming sense of gratitude. I had stumbled into a sanctuary. I had found a chosen family. I was back at their house for Thanksgiving that year, between deployments. We cooked together, watched football, and threw a tennis ball for Gunner until he was exhausted. The house was filled with the easy comfort of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. In their living room, I noticed a framed needlepoint on the wall. It was a Bible verse, Isaiah 41:10. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. It felt like a promise. Before I left that evening, Martha pressed a small silver picture frame into my hands. Inside was a photo we'd taken earlier, all of us on the porch, laughing at something Tom had said. Gunnar was at our feet, his head in my lap. We looked happy. Every family needs a proper family photo, she said with a soft smile. That framed picture has been with me ever since. It's been on my nightstand in Germany, on my desk in Iraq, and packed carefully in my duffel bag on every mission. It was a constant, tangible reminder that I was not alone. It became my anchor. And now, sitting in this cold, hostile lawyer's office, facing the family tied to me by blood but not by heart, my gaze dropped to the worn leather briefcase at my feet. I could feel the hard edge of that picture frame through the leather. Tucked inside, alongside the meticulously organized files and intelligence reports that would decide my future, was that photo. That proof. It gave me strength. It reminded me what this fight was really about. I wasn't just fighting for a company or an inheritance. I was fighting for my own definition of honor. I was fighting for my family, the one I had chosen, and the one that had, against all odds, chosen me back. I remembered a lesson from tactical training. Never reveal your full strength at the outset. Deploy your assets one by one, observe the enemy's reaction, and save your main force for the decisive blow. My father had just deployed his first asset, and the enemy was already in disarray. Tom Harrison let the silence in the room stretch, giving his words time to detonate. He calmly placed the olive-drab binder in the center of the vast mahogany desk. It sat there like an unexploded bomb. The room, which moments before had been filled with smug laughter, was now dead quiet. Before we proceed with Colonel Bond's personal will, he said, his voice calm and deliberate, a rock in a sea of chaos. There is the matter of the corporate assets to clarify. Sebastian let out a short, incredulous laugh. Clarify what? Aegis is mine. It's a formality. Let's get on with it. Mr. Harrison looked directly at my brother, his expression unreadable. Actually, Mr. Bond, it is not. According to these documents, signed and notarized on May 15, 2019, 100% of the ownership of Aegis Dynamics was transferred into an irrevocable trust. He paused, letting the legal weight of the term irrevocable sink in. The air crackled. The sole trustee and beneficiary of that trust, he continued, his voice perfectly even, is Captain Fiona Bond. The room erupted. It wasn't a slow burn, it was an explosion. Sebastian shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. His face, moments ago pale with shock, was now a blotchy, furious red. That's impossible, he roared, pointing a trembling finger at the binder. This is fraud. He wasn't in his right mind. My stepmother, Cynthia, let out a small, horrified gasp, her hand flying to her pearls. My Aunt Patricia's jaw dropped. Then her shock morphed into rage. Her head snapped toward me, her eyes narrowing into slits. Fiona! She shrieked, her voice shrill and ugly. She pointed at me, her finger accusing. What did you do to your father? Did you poison his mind? A girl can't run a man's company. Her words, which once would have sliced me to the bone, now felt like nothing more than static. They were the meaningless noise of a cornered animal. I remained perfectly still in my chair, my back straight, my hands resting calmly on my knees. I watched them. I had spent a career observing enemy combatants in high-stress situations, analyzing their patterns, identifying their weaknesses. And my family, in their panic, was revealing every single one. They were predictable, emotional, weak. Sebastian turned his fury on Mr. Harrison. I'll sue, he growled, leaning over the desk. I'll contest the will. I'll prove he was mentally incompetent. Mr. Harrison, unfazed, calmly turned a page in the binder. He seemed to have been waiting for that exact outburst. Colonel Bond anticipated this possibility, he said, his voice cutting cleanly through Sebastian's tirade. Attached herein is a full psychiatric evaluation, conducted by 3 separate board-certified physicians within 1 week of the signing. All 3 concluded independently that he was of sound mind, memory, and understanding, and was under no duress or undue influence. He looked up, his gaze steady. The transfer is ironclad, Mr. Bond. It is legal and irreversible. It was a perfect legal fortress. My father, the old strategist, had anticipated every possible line of attack and built impenetrable defenses. He knew his son. The fight seemed to drain out of Sebastian all at once, as if someone had pulled a plug. He looked like he'd been physically struck. He staggered back and sank into his chair, the tailored suit suddenly looking too big for him. The arrogant CEO was gone. In his place was a spoiled, frightened man who had just been told the world did not, in fact, revolve around him. The silence that followed was thick with his humiliation. For the first time all day, Sebastian looked directly at me. Truly looked at me. The condescension was gone from his eyes. The pitying amusement was gone. What replaced it was a raw, curdled mixture of hatred and something else. Something that looked a lot like fear. He was finally seeing me, not as his little sister who plays with toy soldiers, but as an adversary. An opponent who had outmaneuvered him. He finally realized he had fundamentally misjudged the battlefield. He leaned forward, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "You think you can do this?" he spat, clinging to the last shreds of his superiority. "You're just a grunt, Fiona. What do you know about Pentagon contracts? What do you know about running a multi-million-dollar corporation?" He was desperate, trying to re-establish the old hierarchy where his MBA and his glib talk automatically placed him above me. He was trying to drag me back onto his turf, the world of business jargon and boardroom politics. He had no idea. He had just handed me the perfect weapon. He had just presented me with a target of opportunity. His question wasn't an insult, it was an invitation. It was the opening I'd been waiting for. I looked back at him, meeting his hateful glare with a calm, steady gaze. And for the first time since I'd walked into that room, I allowed the faintest hint of a smile to touch my lips. "You want to know what I know, Sebastian?" My boxing coach at Bagram used to say, "Never throw the first punch. Dodge, weave, study your opponent. Let him exhaust himself. You wait for the opening, the moment he overextends, and then you throw the one that ends the fight." Sebastian, blinded by a lifetime of unearned confidence and now choked by panic, had just overextended himself completely. He had given me the biggest opening of my life. I took a slow, deep breath. The suffocating air in the room suddenly felt clean and sharp. "You want to know what I know, Sebastian?" My voice was quiet, but it commanded the attention of the room. Slowly, deliberately, I rose from my chair. It was a simple movement, but it shifted the entire gravitational pull of the room. Every eye swiveled to me. I was no longer the quiet little sister in the corner, the uniformed accessory to their family portrait. I was in command now. "I know," I began, my voice steady and clear, cutting through the tension. "That Department of Defense request for proposal, number W56-ZV21R0127, for the Armored Vehicle Communication Upgrade, requires all bidding contractors to be fully compliant with Section 8-89 of the National Defense Authorization Act." I paused, letting the clinical string of code hang in the air. It specifically prohibits the use of certain telecommunications components from designated foreign suppliers, a detail you completely overlooked in last year's submission, which triggered a formal inquiry and almost got this company debarred. A heavy silence fell. I watched the confident smirk slide off Sebastian's face, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then panic. He had no idea what I was talking about. To him, those numbers were just boring, bureaucratic nonsense, details for the little people. To me, they were the difference between mission success and mission failure. They were survival. "I also know," I continued, my voice as cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel, "that the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or FAR Part 15, which governs negotiated contracts, requires a detailed, verifiable cost and pricing analysis, not the ballpark estimates you copied and pasted from some business blog." I took a single, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us. "You love to talk about your MBA and Wall Street, Sebastian. But do you even know the difference between a fixed cost and a cost-plus contract in a defense procurement scenario? Can you calculate the projected lifecycle maintenance cost of a deployed asset in a high-threat environment? He sputtered, his face flushing a deep red. He tried to regain his footing, looking to Mr. Harrison for support. That's what we have lawyers for. I cut him off, my voice sharp. No, Sebastian. A commander has to understand the terrain before he sends his troops into battle. He has to know the rules of engagement. You don't even know how to read the map. My family stared at me, their faces a gallery of shock and disbelief, as if I had just started speaking a foreign language. And in a way, I had. It was the language of competence, and it was completely alien to them. I shifted my gaze to Mr. Harrison, who was watching with a neutral expression. Mr. Harrison, could you please confirm for the record the Aegis Sentinel satellite communications contract, valued at $50 million, signed 3 years ago? The lawyer simply replied, "The contract is a matter of public record." Confirmed. I turned my full attention back to my brother. The Aegis Sentinel contract was his crown jewel, the great success story he would trot out at every family Christmas party. Sebastian, I asked, my voice dangerously quiet, do you remember where you were during the final, most critical negotiation phase for that contract? He stammered, his eyes darting around the room, desperately searching for an escape route. I was on a business trip, he said, his voice weak. In Europe. For market development. No, I said, the single word landing with the force of a slap. You were on a yacht in Monaco for the Formula One Grand Prix. You posted a picture on Instagram, remember? With the champagne. I know this for a fact, because while you were developing markets, I was the one who worked for 72 hours straight from a forward operating base in Kandahar to rerun the entire cybersecurity threat analysis after our intelligence indicated a new vulnerability in the proposed encryption. It was the 7-page report I sent to Dad, time-stamped at Oro 300 Kandahar time, that salvaged the deal and won us that contract. The color completely drained from his face. My stepmother's perfectly painted lips parted in a silent, the sound of her illusions shattering. For the last 10 years, I said, my voice rising, resonating with the weight of a decade of suppressed truth. While you were enjoying the privileges of your position, I was doing the work. In the shadows, I read every proposal, I analyzed every competitor, I leveraged every contact I made at the Pentagon to keep this company afloat. I didn't do it because I wanted the company, Sebastian. I locked eyes with him, and for the first time, he couldn't hold my gaze. I did it because it was my duty to protect our father's legacy. A legacy that you have been systematically dismantling with your incompetence and your arrogance. I reached down and unlatched my worn leather briefcase. I pulled out a thick, meticulously organized binder of my own. It wasn't fancy, bound in expensive leather like Sebastian's proposal. It was a standard issue, government-grade 3-ring binder, black and unassuming. But it was heavy with facts. If you've ever had to work twice as hard just to be considered half as good, I need you to hit that like button right now. And if you believe that true competence will always, eventually triumph over empty arrogance, type, "prove it," in the comments below. Because that's exactly what I was about to do. I placed my binder on the mahogany desk. It landed with a solid, definitive thud that echoed in the silent room, a sound of finality. You have your MBA, Sebastian, I said, my gaze sweeping from my plain binder to his stunned face. I tapped the cover of my file twice, a sharp, deliberate sound, have the evidence. In the Army, we have a process called an after-action review, or AAR. After every mission, you systematically break down what happened, what went right, and what went wrong, based on hard data. You strip away ego and emotion and focus on the facts. For the last 5 years, I had been conducting a quiet, continuous AAR on Sebastian's leadership. My binder was the final report. I opened it. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. My voice was calm and measured, the same tone I would use to deliver an intelligence briefing. This is a top-level performance analysis of Aegis Dynamics for the past 5 fiscal years. I began, turning the binder so they could see the first page. It was a simple line graph. These green arrows indicate periods of significant revenue growth, Coincidentally, they align perfectly with the dates the company was awarded major government contracts. I tapped a point on the graph. And next to each arrow, you will find a footnote cross-referencing the strategic intelligence reports and competitive analysis I sent to my father from my posts in Germany, Iraq, and Afghanistan. I flipped the page. The next chart was a mirror image, but in red. Conversely, I continued, these red arrows indicate revenue downturns, missed projections, or lost contracts. Surprisingly, they seem to correlate directly with your ski trips to Aspen, your sailing regattas in Saint-Tropez, and that month-long trip to Thailand, Sebastian. My stepmother gasped softly. Sebastian looked like he was suffocating, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He couldn't breathe because the facts were sucking all the air out of the room. I understand this might be difficult to believe based on anecdotal evidence, I said, my voice devoid of any sarcasm. So, I've included a few clarifying communications. I reached into a side pocket of the binder and pulled out a single printed sheet of paper. I slid it across the mahogany table toward my brother. It stopped directly in front of him. This is an email you sent to our father in 2020. It was after I had flagged a critical security vulnerability in the beta version of our Aegis Sentinel software. I let my eyes meet his. You wrote, and I quote, "Dad, I think you need to tell Fiona to stand down. A military bookworm's pet theories aren't applicable to the real world of business." I let the words hang in the air for a long moment. 3 months after you sent that email, one of our primary competitors exploited that exact vulnerability to underbid us on the Stratcom contract renewal. It cost this company $10 million. I looked directly at him. That's the real world of business, Sebastian. My Aunt Patricia, who had always praised Sebastian's business acumen at every family gathering, was now staring at her hands in her lap, her face pale. The architect of her nephew's myth was watching her creation crumble. I turned to the final section of my report. My father knew all of this. He wasn't blind. He was a soldier, and above all else, he believed in meritocracy. He believed that rank, position, and command had to be earned, not inherited. I looked at Sebastian. He gave you every opportunity, every resource, every chance to prove yourself capable of leading. But you saw it as a privilege, not a responsibility. You took the position, but you refused the duty. My gaze swept across the room, landing on each of them in turn. My silent stepmother, my shocked aunt, my clueless cousins. This trust, this transfer of ownership, it isn't a punishment. It was a calculated, strategic decision to preserve his life's work. It was an act of corporate survival. He placed Aegis in the hands of the only person who had consistently fought for it. I closed the binder with a quiet final click. That concludes my presentation. I sat down. The silence that followed was heavier and more absolute than anything that had come before. The checkmate had been declared. The game was over. Mr. Harrison allowed the silence to hold for a few more seconds, giving the verdict time to settle. Then he cleared his throat and picked up the original will, the one Sebastian had been so eager to hear. "Thank you, Captain Bond," he said formally. He then adjusted his glasses. "Now, regarding the personal assets of Colonel Thomas Bond, the house in Coronado, along with its attendant mortgage and property taxes, is bequeathed to Mr. Sebastian Bond." Sebastian didn't even react. He was still reeling from the public execution of his career. The remaining liquid assets, investments, and cash holdings are to be divided equally among the family members present, Mr. Harrison continued. He paused, looking down at the final paragraph. And finally, the Bond family collection of historical firearms, as previously mentioned, is bequeathed to Captain Fiona Bond, along with all accompanying provenance documents and appraisal records. A weak, strangled sound came from Sebastian. It was a pathetic attempt at a dismissive laugh. "Great," he muttered, shaking his head. "She gets a bunch of old, rusty toys." It was his last, feeble attempt to belittle me, to cling to the idea that he had still, somehow, come out on top. But Mr. Harrison wasn't finished. He looked up from the page, over the rim of his glasses. "The most recent appraisal, conducted last month at the Colonel's request," he said, his voice perfectly level. valued the collection at $650,000. $650,000. Tom Harrison's words didn't boom. They didn't need to. They landed in the stunned silence of the room with the quiet, devastating impact of a sniper round. The number hung in the air, seeming to distort the very atmosphere of the office. Sebastian's pathetic, dismissive laugh choked in his throat, turning into a wet, gasping cough as if he were trying to swallow broken glass. "What?" he croaked, his voice cracking. His eyes, wide with disbelief, darted from Mr. Harrison to me and back again, searching for the punchline to a joke that wasn't coming. My Aunt Patricia, who had been staring blankly at the rug, shook her head. "That's impossible," she muttered to no one in particular. "They're just rusty old guns." I looked at them, at their confused, horrified faces, and for the first time all day, a flicker of pity arose. They lived in a glittering, disposable world of fast fashion and new tech. They were utterly incapable of understanding the value of things that endure, things steeped in history. I remembered the quiet hours spent with my father in his study, the smell of gun oil and old wood as he taught me how to care for each piece. He'd tell me their stories, where they'd been, what they'd seen. Those were some of the only moments we ever truly connected, not as colonel and cadet, but as father and daughter. This wasn't just a collection, it was the last piece of him I had left. My voice was quiet, not gloating, simply stating a fact. The 1847 Colt Walker in that collection is one of only 1,100 ever made. Less than 1,000 are believed to still exist. Our great-great-grandfather carried it in the Mexican-American War. I looked at Sebastian. To you, it's an old, rusty toy. To me, it's our history. You could see the frantic calculations grinding in Sebastian's head. His expression shifted through a rapid, brutal series of stages. Disbelief, dawning comprehension, and finally, a deep, soul-crushing despair. The horrifying equation settled in his eyes. He was now the owner of an expensive waterfront house with a mountain of debt. Meanwhile, his little sister, who plays with toy soldiers, not only controlled the multi-million-dollar company, but now also possessed over $500,000 in liquid assets from the very rusty old toys he had just mocked. The carefully constructed facade of Sebastian Bond, MBA, the confident heir apparent, didn't just crack. It shattered into a million pieces. He slumped forward, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. No, this can't be happening," he mumbled into the polished mahogany of the table that was supposed to have been his throne. A loud theatrical sob erupted from my stepmother. Cynthia was weeping, her meticulously applied mascara beginning to run, not for her husband's legacy or her stepson's ruin, but for the impending loss of her luxurious lifestyle. The charity luncheons, the country club membership, the black tie galas, the foundation of her world had just been condemned. Mr. Harrison waited for the initial shockwave to pass before he reached into the binder one last time. "The colonel left one final, personal letter," he announced, his voice bringing a fresh wave of silence to the room. He requested that I read it aloud. He unfolded a single sheet of my father's official letterhead. It was my father's familiar, sharp, angular handwriting. "To my children," Mr. Harrison began to read, his voice filling the room with my father's final words. "A legacy is not what you find in a bank account. That is merely inheritance. A true legacy is built on honor, on responsibility, and on an understanding of the value of what came before you. It is knowing the difference between the price of something and its worth. Sebastian, my son, I gave you every advantage, a top-tier education, a position of power, my trust. But you only ever valued the things that glittered. You dismissed anything that required patience or respect. You saw tradition as a burden and duty as a chore. Fiona, my daughter, I admit I gave you nothing. No encouragement, no praise, and yet you built everything for yourself. You chose the harder path, the one of service, and in doing so, you came to understand the true meaning of honor. You see the value in history, not just the sparkle of the new. Aegis needs a soldier at its helm, not a salesman. The collection needs a custodian, a guardian of its history, not a cynic who would sell it for parts. I have made my choice. Now, you must live with yours. Mr. Harrison carefully refolded the letter. The meeting was over. The battle was won. I stood up, my muscles feeling light, unburdened from a weight I had carried for most of my life. I gave a slight, formal nod to Mr. Harrison, a silent thank you for his integrity. Then I turned and walked toward the door, not looking back at the wreckage of my family. The air in the hallway outside felt cleaner. I was almost to the elevators when I heard the sound of a chair being violently shoved aside, followed by my name being called in a desperate, ragged shout. "Fiona, wait, we need to talk." Sebastian scrambled out of the office, his expensive suit now rumpled. He caught up to me just as the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and he physically blocked my path. His face was a mask of raw panic. "We're family, Fiona," he pleaded, the words sounding absurd, a desperate last-ditch appeal to a sentiment he had never honored. I looked him straight in the eye. I saw a man who had just lost everything he had ever taken for granted and was only now beginning to comprehend the vast ruin of his own making. "Really, Sebastian?" I said, my voice as cold and clear as ice. "Is family something you only remember when you need something from me?" In hostage negotiation training, they teach you a fundamental principle: never negotiate from a position of weakness. You establish control, you define the non-negotiable boundaries, and you must always be willing to walk away. Sebastian didn't realize it, but standing there in the lobby, he was the hostage taker, and he was trying to take my future captive using our past. But I was no longer a hostage. "We need to talk," he repeated, his voice laced with a pleading tone I'd never heard from him before. It was the sound of a king who had just lost his kingdom. "Fiona, I'm your brother." I looked at him, at his desperate eyes and disheveled appearance. I felt no anger, no triumph, only a cold, hard clarity. "You were never a brother to me, Sebastian," I said, my voice even. "You were a competitor, a rival who made it his mission to ensure I always knew my place. And my place, according to you, was always beneath you." He tried to change tactics, digging for a shared emotional history that didn't exist. "Don't you remember when we were kids?" he asked, his voice softening. "That old Schwinn bicycle? I taught you how to ride it. I held on until you found your balance." A faint memory surfaced: the scraped knees, the wobbly handlebars, his hand on the back of the seat. "I remember," I nodded slowly. "And I remember you laughing your head off when I failed my first driver's test. I remember you telling all your friends that me going to West Point was a total waste because I'd just get married and pregnant. I remember 1,000 other cuts, Sebastian." I looked him straight in the eye. One good deed from 20 years ago doesn't erase a decade of disrespect. It doesn't buy you a free pass. The desperation in his eyes intensified. He dropped the pretense. "I need a position at the company," he said, the words tumbling out, stripped of their usual polish. "Any position. A consultant, VP of anything. I'll work for you." It was the ultimate concession, the final surrender. But it came years too late. In the army, a dereliction of duty on the battlefield isn't forgiven just because the soldier says he's sorry after the battle is lost. "No," I said. The word was quiet but absolute. There was no room for negotiation in it. Aegis Dynamics is a defense contractor, Sebastian, not a family charity. Every position on that org chart comes with immense responsibility. It requires competence, and it requires trust. Based on your performance record, you've failed on both counts. The elevator chimed, its doors sliding open into a silent, empty car. I stepped inside, turning to face him. "This isn't revenge," I told him, my voice flat. "This is a standard. A standard of excellence and accountability that you were never required to meet. Until now." As the polished steel doors began to close, he made one last, desperate appeal. "So what about family?" he called out, his voice echoing in the marble lobby. "Are you just going to throw us all away?" I looked at his desperate, crumbling face for the last time. "Family are the people who lift you up, Sebastian, not the ones who hold you down," I said, just before the doors sealed him from my view. "Family is about respect, not ridicule." The doors closed with a soft thud, encasing me in the quiet, sterile box. As the elevator began its smooth ascent, I didn't feel a rush of victory. I didn't feel triumphant joy. I felt light. An immense, profound lightness, as if a physical weight I had been carrying on my shoulders my entire life had just been lifted and dissolved into nothing. I hadn't thrown my family away. I had simply stopped allowing them to be the anchor that defined my place in the water. 3 weeks later, my honorable discharge papers were finalized. I drove my Jeep down the Pacific Coast Highway, the California sun glinting off the modern glass facade of the Aegis Dynamics headquarters. This time, I didn't enter as a visitor, as the Colonel's daughter or Sebastian's little sister. I walked through the main entrance, the glass doors sliding open before me. The new security badge in my hand was simple and clean. It read, Fiona Bond, CEO. Heads turned as I walked through the lobby. I saw the curious glances, the whispers exchanged between employees. I didn't pay them any mind. My focus was singular. I walked straight to the executive elevator and rode it to the top floor, to the corner office that had been my father's. It was vast, with a panoramic view of the endless blue of the Pacific Ocean. The large mahogany desk was completely bare, cleared of all of my father's personal effects, save for one. Standing alone in the center of the desk was a single, silver-framed photograph. It was the one of my father and me on my graduation day at West Point. The one he'd looked so distracted and distant in. But looking at it now, I could see something I'd missed before. A flicker of pride in his eyes that he could never bring himself to say aloud. A single tear traced a path down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or of anger. It was a tear of release. The long war was over. My new mission was just beginning. Under my command, Aegis Dynamics underwent a quiet revolution. There was no corporate restructuring memo, no grand announcement of a new company culture. There was only a shift in principle. I brought the ethos of the military into the boardroom. Mission first, people always. The opaque deals negotiated on the 18th hole of a golf course vanished. The bloated executive positions created for cousins and friends of the family were eliminated. In their place, I built a culture of meritocracy, transparency, and relentless discipline. Competence and results were the only currency that mattered. I rebuilt the leadership team from the ground up, bringing in some of the sharpest strategic minds and most talented engineers I had ever known. Many of them were fellow veterans, men and women who understood that accountability wasn't a buzzword, it was a lifeline. We started winning bigger, more prestigious contracts, not through slick social connections, but through superior technology and a reputation for absolute reliability. The walls of my office weren't adorned with expensive abstract art. They were covered in strategic maps, project timelines, and threat assessment charts. Aegis became what my father had always intended it to be, a shield, forged with integrity. Occasionally, news of Sebastian would filter back to me through the grapevine. After being forced to sell the Coronado house at a loss to cover the debts he'd accumulated, he struggled. His MBA and the Bond family name, once a golden ticket, were now just a tarnished brand without the family company to back it up. The last I heard, he was working as a mid-level sales associate for a small software company in Irvine, reporting to a manager a decade younger than him. I felt no joy at his downfall, no satisfying sense of vengeance. There was only the cold, impartial truth. The real world, the one without the protective bubble of privilege, had finally caught up with him. He wasn't my victim. He was a casualty of his own choices. One quiet Saturday afternoon, I was in my father's old study at the now empty Coronado house, sorting through his personal effects before the new owners took possession. In the back of his desk drawer, beneath old medals and photographs, I found a worn leather-bound journal. Inside, written in his precise hand, were pages of ideas he had sketched out years ago. One of them was a detailed plan for a mentorship program to help veterans transition from military service into the civilian tech sector. It was an idea I'd never heard about, an idea that Sebastian had likely dismissed as having no ROI. As I read my father's notes, I saw the true shape of his legacy. He wrote, "A good soldier doesn't just win battles, they build a lasting peace." In that moment, I knew my mission wasn't just to run Aegis. It was to build a lasting peace for others like me. I took a significant portion of the company's profits that year and established the Thomas Bond Foundation. Its sole purpose was to fund the Aegis Initiative, a scholarship and mentorship program designed specifically for female veterans seeking careers in defense and technology. It provided not just money for education, but paid internships at Aegis and one-on-one guidance from our top engineers and strategists. It was the program my father had dreamed of, reborn and given a purpose that was now deeply personal to me. It was how I would truly honor his name. Today, 2 years later, I stood on a small stage in the main atrium of the Aegis building. The first annual Aegis Initiative Scholarship Ceremony was underway. Our first recipient was a young, recently discharged Air Force Staff Sergeant, a signals intelligence specialist with brilliant, perceptive eyes. I saw in her a fierce intelligence, but also a flicker of the same uncertainty I remembered feeling when I stood before the gates of West Point. She was a mirror of a younger me. After I gave my speech, I called her to the stage. I handed her the oversized check and the official certificate. The applause from the assembled employees and guests was warm and genuine. As we posed for a photo, she leaned in and spoke to me, her voice a near whisper, filled with an emotion that I understood completely. "Ma'am," she said, "thank you for giving us a chance. Thank you for seeing us." I smiled, a real, unburdened smile. That was the moment. That was the victory. The sweetest revenge isn't watching your enemies fall. It's living a life so good and so meaningful that they become irrelevant. It's using your strength not to crush those who hurt you, but to lift up those who are walking the same stony path you once did. It's becoming the person you needed most when you were at your lowest. That is the only victory that truly matters. And that's where my new mission began. Not a mission of conflict, but of creation. My story is proof that your worth is not determined by the family you were born into, but by the legacy you choose to build. If any part of my journey resonated with you, the feeling of being unseen, the fight to prove your value, or the peace that comes from setting your own standards, please let me know in the comments. Your stories give us all strength. Like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience and true victory. Remember, you always have the power to create your own dawn.